The fracture of the global digital landscape is no longer a distant speculation, but a visible threshold now crossed, and the dividing line is marked not by geography alone but by code, data, and sovereignty claims over artificial intelligence systems. Global corporations that once thrived on unified cloud markets now confront the reality of parallel internet spheres, forced to choose alignment with one regulatory bloc at the cost of access to others. Supply chains in semiconductors, rare earths, and advanced networking equipment fracture further, deepening inflationary pressures and slowing technological diffusion. Countries in the global south, previously beneficiaries of affordable AI services from multiple providers, are forced into dependent relationships with whichever bloc secures their compliance, whether through infrastructure investments, digital loans, or binding security agreements. The illusion of AI as a universal equalizer shatters, replaced by a reality in which AI becomes the sharpest wedge-driving economic stratification among nations. Diplomatic and political pressure grows as governments mobilize narratives of digital sovereignty. The United States frames its controls as a defense of liberal norms, while China advances the rhetoric of technological self-determination and resistance to Western dominance. Smaller states, caught in between, are compelled to sign memoranda of understanding, digital trade agreements, or defense technology pacts that anchor them irreversibly to one camp. International organizations, from the UN to the WTO, attempt to moderate disputes, but lack the enforcement power to harmonize diverging AI regimes. Instead of convergence, forums become arenas for confrontation, where accusations of data espionage, cyber interference, and algorithmic manipulation dominate proceedings. The language of a shared global internet collapses into competing doctrines of digital security, each casting the other as a threat to sovereignty and stability. The open-ended conclusion reveals the gravity of the shift. The new digital Iron Curtain is not built overnight nor in isolation. It is layered onto existing geopolitical fractures, trade wars, territorial disputes, military alliances, and resource competitions. Unlike the mid-20th century Iron Curtain, this one is invisible to the eye yet pervasive in its reach, shaping how societies communicate, innovate, and even imagine the world. Whether this fragmentation solidifies into a permanent bipolar order or drifts into multipolar instability remains unresolved, but the trajectory is clear. Artificial intelligence, the defining technology of the century, is not unifying humanity under a common horizon, but dividing it into fortified spheres of control, where every algorithm carries the weight of geopolitical allegiance. The question that follows is not whether fragmentation can be reversed, but whether the fractures now visible can be managed without tipping into a global crisis that fuses digital conflict with military confrontation. The hook lies in the paradox that the very technology designed to dissolve barriers of language, distance, and culture has become the instrument through which a new Iron Curtain is being drawn. One made not of steel and concrete, but of algorithms, firewalls, and divergent regulatory regimes. The event description begins with the rapid acceleration of AI adoption, where nations once aligned under a relatively unified digital marketplace now diverge sharply as Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Moscow entrench competing standards for data governance, AI ethics, and cybersecurity frameworks. What was initially presented as regional regulatory caution has hardened into systemic vulnerability, with AI systems increasingly incompatible across borders, fragmenting global supply chains and communications infrastructures in ways that mirror the Cold War's bifurcated order. Systemic vulnerability emerges at multiple layers. First, the technical incompatibility of AI architectures, where large language models and autonomous systems are trained on isolated pools of data and reinforced by nationally mandated censorship, reduces interoperability and fosters suspicion. Second, the geopolitical weaponization of algorithms, where states restrict access to advanced chips, foundational models, and cross-border data flows, creates choke points not only in military applications, but in civilian infrastructure, from healthcare to transportation. Third, the financial ecosystem, heavily reliant on seamless cloud-based AI platforms, becomes prone to rupture when access is abruptly severed, undermining multinational firms and exposing economies to cascading failures. The escalation into military dimensions follows naturally. The AI fragmentation is not occurring in isolation, but against the backdrop of intensifying great power rivalry, where the race to integrate machine learning into command and control systems, drone swarms, and cyber offense capabilities accelerates. The United States insists on controlling semiconductor exports to China, while Beijing doubles down on indigenous chip production and closed-loop AI ecosystems. Europe attempts to insulate itself with strict AI regulations, while simultaneously depending on external suppliers for critical technologies. Moscow, facing sanctions and isolation, forges deeper technological alignments with Beijing, embedding its military infrastructure into a parallel AI ecosystem designed explicitly to evade Western surveillance and control. The risk is not only in arms competition, but in systemic miscommunication. With different AI architectures unable to interoperate, the potential for miscalculation during crisis escalations grows, as autonomous systems may interpret actions through incompatible frameworks, triggering unintended escalations in contested theaters from the South China Sea to Eastern Europe. The economic ripples spread with equal intensity. The narrative of AI fragmentation advances from its initial fractures into a deepening systemic divide, as governments, corporations, and militaries entrench their positions behind increasingly rigid digital barriers. What began as competing frameworks for AI governance evolves into a sustained rupture, where the logic of separation permeates every layer of global interaction. The economic ripples widen in scope. Global companies that once depended on a single digital marketplace now restructure into regional silos, duplicating infrastructure to comply with fragmented regimes. This duplication drives costs upward, slowing innovation and narrowing consumer access. Supply chains reliant on cross-border data flows fracture under pressure, with advanced manufacturing increasingly concentrated in nations that can guarantee sovereign AI ecosystems. For countries outside the primary blocs, the cost of choosing alignment becomes existential. African nations receiving Chinese-funded digital infrastructure risk exclusion from Western financial markets, while Latin American states drawn into U.S. security frameworks struggle to retain access to Chinese 5G and cloud services. India, positioning itself as a third pole, launches national AI platforms but faces constant pressure to align either westward or eastward, a balancing act fraught with economic risk. Inflation, inequality, and technological stratification grow sharper as access to cutting-edge AI becomes a privilege of bloc membership rather than a global public good. The political and diplomatic layer hardens. The United States mobilizes alliances under the rhetoric of protecting democratic values in digital space, advancing new coalitions that treat AI alignment as a security imperative. China counters with its Digital Silk Road initiative, framing AI partnerships as instruments of sovereignty and resistance against Western dominance. Russia uses its alignment with Beijing as a shield against sanctions, exporting AI-driven surveillance tools to allied regimes in exchange for political loyalty. The European Union, while projecting itself as a regulatory superpower, increasingly finds itself squeezed between Washington's security imperatives and Beijing's commercial reach, leading to internal divisions over how tightly to align with either camp. International organizations fail to establish consensus frameworks. Discussions at the UN on AI governance collapse into accusations of hypocrisy, espionage, and manipulation. In place of global cooperation, fragmented forums emerge. US-led summits on AI security, China-led conferences on digital sovereignty, and Russian-sponsored alliances for counter-sanctions coordination. The open-ended conclusion to this stage underscores the permanence of fragmentation. The digital Iron Curtain now functions as both a boundary and a filter, shaping how information flows, how economies interact, and how militaries prepare for confrontation. Unlike the physical Cold War curtain, this divide penetrates homes, workplaces, and schools, subtly but inexorably altering the lived experience of billions. The danger is not only that global AI fragmentation persists, but that it becomes normalized, its risks overlooked until a crisis forces its consequences into view. The unresolved question is whether humanity can create mechanisms of limited interoperability or crisis communication in a world where AI ecosystems are designed to exclude and dominate rather than share and integrate. The precedent of nuclear hotlines during the Cold War offers a sobering parallel. Without channels of coordination, the risk is not managed rivalry but catastrophic miscalculation, this time carried out by systems that process faster than human reflexes and escalate without human intent. The hook in this phase is the realization that fragmentation is not a temporary disruption, but the structural baseline upon which future conflicts and alignments are being built, and its permanence is reinforced daily by a cycle of sanctions, counter-sanctions, and regulatory hardening. The event description unfolds through the visible tightening of controls. Washington expands its blacklist of Chinese AI firms, Beijing accelerates the rollout of state-backed generative models restricted to domestic markets, and Brussels formalizes sweeping compliance measures that force global companies to restructure their operations around the European standards or abandon the market entirely. Moscow, meanwhile, absorbs the consequences of its isolation by tethering its digital infrastructure to China's networks, while smaller regional powers such as Turkey, Iran, and India experiment with hybrid systems that balance access with autonomy, creating a patchwork of incompatible standards. The systemic vulnerabilities now multiply. On the technical front, AI models evolve in divergent directions, trained on datasets cleansed or skewed by political imperatives, creating not just incompatibility but distortion. Citizens within one bloc consume information shaped by their AI systems, reinforcing political narratives and reducing exposure to alternative perspectives. This accelerates digital echo chambers on a planetary scale, entrenching ideological divides. On the economic front, the reliance on proprietary chips and controlled access to cloud services creates bottlenecks so acute that entire sectors, logistics, agriculture, and even education, become hostage to the geopolitical posture of their suppliers. On the social front, populations grow dependent on AI systems that reflect not universal human knowledge, but the curated priorities of their governments, eroding trust in cross-border communication. This layered fragility means that a shock in one sphere, such as a semiconductor export ban or a sudden cyber attack, ripples uncontrollably across multiple domains. The military dimension escalates with sharper clarity. Autonomous weapon systems, once tested in controlled environments, are now deployed in active theaters under the control of AI trained exclusively on national datasets. The risk here is not simply technological superiority, but systemic misalignment. When an American or European drone swarm faces a Chinese or Russian counterpart, the absence of shared protocols or interoperable standards raises the possibility of automated escalation without human mediation. Military planners in NATO express alarm over Beijing's advances in algorithmic warfare, while Chinese analysts highlight Washington's integration of AI into missile defense and satellite coordination. Moscow intensifies its cyber offense capabilities, exploiting AI to launch precision disinformation campaigns against Western societies, while simultaneously adopting Chinese AI platforms to manage battlefield logistics in Ukraine. The result is a dangerous feedback loop. Each side interprets the other's AI deployment as evidence of aggressive intent, justifying further militarization and deepening the reliance on systems that cannot communicate, de-escalate, or clarify intent. The intensification of AI fragmentation enters its third stage, where the logic of separation ceases to be framed as temporary or tactical, and instead becomes the accepted foundation of the emerging world order. The hook is the dawning recognition that the new digital Iron Curtain is not just dividing systems, but reshaping how power is conceived, exercised, and contested, embedding itself into the daily function of societies and the strategic doctrines of states. Semiconductor supply chains become militarized choke points, with Washington tightening restrictions on high-end chip exports to China and Beijing, retaliating with export controls on rare earth minerals essential for chip manufacturing. Inflationary pressures spread across industries reliant on AI-driven logistics and production optimization, with the Global South particularly exposed to price volatility and supply disruptions. Nations outside the primary blocs experience coercive diplomacy. Offers of infrastructure aid or cloud services come tied to binding political alignment, effectively transforming digital policy into an extension of foreign policy. The dream of AI as a universal engine of efficiency collapses into the reality of AI as an accelerant of global inequality. Diplomatic and political pressure intensifies in parallel. Washington frames AI fragmentation as a moral struggle, insisting that democratic states must secure their digital borders against authoritarian manipulation. Beijing promotes its digital Silk Road as a pathway to sovereignty, depicting Western restrictions as neo-colonial attempts to stifle technological independence. Moscow leverages its alignment with China to export AI-driven security systems to governments in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, consolidating influence while deepening its detachment from Western markets. Within Europe, divisions widen as member states weigh the economic costs of aligning too closely with Washington's security posture against the risks of dependence on Chinese infrastructure. International institutions fail to mediate effectively. Attempts at global agreements on AI governance collapse into mutual recriminations, with blocs accusing one another of cyber sabotage, intellectual property theft, and algorithmic manipulation. The failure of these forums signals that fragmentation is no longer reversible by multilateral consensus. The open-ended conclusion underscores the permanence of this phase. The digital Iron Curtain has shifted from being an emergent phenomenon to a structural reality embedded in law, military doctrine, and economic systems. Its consequences are no longer confined to the realm of geopolitics, but reach into the daily lives of billions, shaping education, healthcare, commerce, and communication. The unresolved danger is that fragmentation itself may become self-reinforcing, with each bloc doubling down on isolation in response to perceived threats, closing the door to future reintegration. Unlike the Cold War, where the Iron Curtain had a defined physical boundary, this divide is diffuse, invisible, and omnipresent, touching every digital interaction. The pressing question is whether humanity can develop crisis management tools robust enough to handle the accelerating risks of miscalculation, or whether the fragmentation of AI ecosystems will drive the world into a cycle of compounding instability that no state can fully control. The event description unfolds through accelerating developments. The United States implements mandatory compliance checks on all AI tools used in critical infrastructure, effectively banning software with even indirect ties to Chinese firms. Beijing responds by fully nationalizing its largest AI platforms, binding them to state security imperatives. Brussels pushes forward with an AI Act that forces companies to expose proprietary algorithms or face expulsion from the European market. Moscow deepens its reliance on joint Chinese-Russian AI projects to manage logistics, surveillance, and censorship, extending their reach into allied states across Central Asia. The fragmentation becomes visible not just in policy announcements, but in the lived texture of digital space, where users in one block encounter a digital environment entirely different from those across the divide, marked by censored information, incompatible applications, and increasingly divergent cultural narratives. The systemic vulnerabilities widen further. On the technical side, the lack of interoperability creates structural fragility, as corporations and governments find themselves locked into single-vendor ecosystems with no redundancy. If a cloud provider in one block experiences disruption, states tied to that ecosystem cannot pivot to alternatives without violating sanctions or triggering diplomatic crises. On the financial side, venture capital flows into AI innovation collapse into regional silos, starving global startups of cross-border funding and forcing them into political alignment to survive. On the societal side, populations become increasingly shaped by AI models that reinforce state-approved narratives, reducing exposure to alternative perspectives and creating ideological insulation at scale. This insulation produces a new kind of vulnerability. When crises erupt, populations conditioned by their AI systems respond with hardened suspicion, making diplomatic de-escalation more difficult and fueling cycles of mistrust. The military escalation follows naturally. The integration of AI into command, control, and communications accelerates, with blocs prioritizing national security applications at the expense of transparency or interoperability. U.S. military doctrine increasingly emphasizes algorithmic warfare, using AI to coordinate missile defense, satellite surveillance, and autonomous drone swarms. China, in turn, develops closed-loop AI architectures designed for asymmetric warfare, focusing on cyber disruption, information control, and hypersonic missile targeting. Russia deploys Chinese-derived AI systems in Ukraine and other contested zones, combining battlefield automation with digital propaganda campaigns aimed at Western societies. NATO responds by experimenting with real-time AI decision assist systems in exercises, but analysts warn that the absence of shared standards between rival AI militaries increases the risk of misinterpretation and uncontrolled escalation. The specter of autonomous escalation looms larger. Systems trained on incompatible datasets may interpret a maneuver as an attack, triggering retaliation without human authorization. The military arena becomes not just an arms race but an algorithmic standoff where the smallest miscalculation could spiral beyond human control. The economic ripple effects deepen into structural distortions. Global corporations face the collapse of the assumption that products or services can scale universally. Instead, they duplicate infrastructure, run separate research pipelines, and maintain parallel compliance teams, inflating costs and slowing innovation. The fourth stage of AI fragmentation reveals itself as the moment when the divide ceases to be a contest of standards and becomes a lived reality that dictates alliances, trade patterns, and even the architecture of conflict. The hook lies in the accelerating shift from a world of contested interoperability to one of hardened exclusivity, where the assumption that digital networks could still converge is replaced by the recognition that fragmentation is permanent and totalizing. The global south becomes the terrain of economic competition. African states are offered subsidized access to Chinese AI infrastructure tied to long-term debt agreements, while Washington counteroffers with security pacts and financial assistance conditional on rejecting Chinese technologies. Latin America and Southeast Asia are similarly pulled into the contest, with governments forced to align or risk exclusion from both digital markets. Inequality deepens as states locked into weaker ecosystems struggle to maintain competitiveness, and their populations face rising costs for basic services increasingly mediated by AI. Diplomatic and political pressures intensify in lockstep with economic fragmentation. Washington formalizes new coalitions, digital equivalents of NATO, that treat AI alignment as a matter of national security. Beijing consolidates its digital Silk Road into a binding multilateral framework, framing it as a resistance bloc against Western technological hegemony. Moscow reinforces this divide by exporting Chinese AI surveillance systems to allied regimes, embedding loyalty through technological dependency. Europe attempts to chart a middle course, projecting regulatory authority, but facing internal fractures as member states debate the costs of aligning too closely with Washington or tolerating Chinese systems. International organizations weaken further, their inability to mediate disputes now visible in repeated diplomatic failures. Instead of collective governance, fragmented forums emerge. US-led summits emphasizing AI security and democracy, China-led gatherings celebrating digital sovereignty, and Russia-backed conferences framing AI as a weapon of resistance against sanctions. Multilateralism collapses into bloc politics, with every negotiation framed as a zero-sum contest. The open-ended conclusion highlights the structural transformation now underway. The digital Iron Curtain has shifted from metaphor to lived infrastructure, one that is not merely dividing states but shaping how societies think, communicate, and organize themselves. Its presence is invisible yet total. From the apps people use to the news they consume, from the products they buy to the wars they fight. The unresolved danger is that the very logic of fragmentation becomes self-perpetuating. Once states, corporations, and militaries adapt to permanent division, incentives to reverse it disappear. The world enters an era not of temporary crisis but of long-term structural rivalry, where each technological advance is both a tool of progress within a bloc and a weapon of exclusion against the other. The central question now is no longer whether reintegration is possible, but whether a fragmented digital order can avoid tipping into open conflict when the systems designed to separate are also programmed to compete. The event description captures the crystallization of this divide. Washington codifies export bans into long-term strategy, embedding them into defense budgets and trade laws. Beijing announces the completion of its first fully sovereign AI supply chain, independent of Western chips. Brussels forces multinational corporations to maintain separate European compliance frameworks under threat of severe penalties, and Moscow openly declares its allegiance to a Beijing-centered digital sphere, calling it a civilizational choice. Beyond these formal moves, the everyday signs are stark. Digital platforms no longer speak across borders, search results diverge dramatically between blocs, and citizens experience wholly different versions of reality mediated by incompatible algorithmic systems. Systemic vulnerability deepens under these conditions. The technical fracture hardens into digital autarky, where each bloc is forced to maintain its own end-to-end supply chains, leading to duplication, inefficiency, and brittleness. States that cannot afford self-sufficiency are locked into dependency, losing digital sovereignty in exchange for access. The financial system grows more fragile as cross-border capital flows into AI diminish, and regional capital pools prove insufficient to sustain global innovation. Trust evaporates in the digital commons as accusations of backdoors, espionage, and algorithmic manipulation render every technology exchange a potential national security risk. On the societal front, the insulation of information ecosystems accelerates polarization. Populations shaped by bloc-specific AI develop not only divergent perspectives, but entirely separate epistemologies, undermining the possibility of shared facts or mutual understanding. In this climate, even humanitarian crises are interpreted through the lens of digital propaganda, further reducing the scope for cooperation. The military escalation becomes sharper and more dangerous. AI-driven weapons are no longer confined to experimental deployment, but integrated into live operations. In the South China Sea, Chinese AI-guided surveillance drones patrol contested waters, interpreting Western maneuvers as provocations through closed-loop threat assessment systems. In Eastern Europe, NATO exercises integrate AI into battlefield simulations where predictive analytics guide troop deployments. Russia deploys Chinese AI logistics systems to maintain supply chains under sanctions, while simultaneously escalating cyber attacks against Western financial institutions using AI-enhanced malware. The absence of interoperability between rival AI systems means that the margin for error narrows dangerously. An automated misclassification of an adversary's move can set off a chain of retaliation faster than humans can intervene. Military analysts warn that the combination of autonomous systems, fragmented data, and heightened mistrust creates a new condition of permanent escalation, where crises cannot easily be de-escalated because the systems involved are designed for competition, not dialogue. The economic ripple effects reach systemic proportions. Semiconductor supply chains, already strained, collapse into fully militarized choke points. Washington tightens restrictions on chip exports, forcing global corporations to divest from Chinese markets, while Beijing retaliates with restrictions on rare earth minerals, disrupting Western industries from defense to renewable energy. Inflation surges across multiple sectors, not only from supply disruptions, but from the cost of duplicating AI infrastructures across blocs. The fifth stage of this unfolding narrative captures the point at which AI fragmentation has matured from an accelerating rupture into a structural condition that dictates not only the architecture of global power, but also the psychology of international relations. The hook lies in the realization that the new digital Iron Curtain is not a temporary disruption, but a permanent reality, one that redefines how nations perceive threats, opportunities, and their very sense of sovereignty. Semiconductor supply chains remain militarized, with Washington tightening export controls, and Beijing leveraging rare earth monopolies to retaliate, producing cycles of disruption that spread across industries from consumer electronics to renewable energy. The global south becomes the decisive battleground. African states, bound by Chinese infrastructure loans, find themselves tethered to Beijing's ecosystem, while Latin American nations negotiate U.S. security guarantees in exchange for rejecting Chinese AI. Southeast Asia and the Middle East fracture along similar lines, each state coerced into alignment by offers of aid or threats of exclusion. Inequality deepens globally as bloc membership determines access to cutting-edge AI, while others are left behind in digital dependency. The political and diplomatic pressures harden further. Washington frames the divide as an existential defense of democracy, embedding AI fragmentation into the rhetoric of freedom versus authoritarianism. Beijing counters with a narrative of sovereignty and resistance, portraying Western restrictions as a continuation of colonial subjugation. Moscow amplifies this division by exporting surveillance tools to regimes that embrace authoritarian control, securing loyalty through technological dependence. The European Union clings to its role as a regulatory power, but internal fractures widen as economic costs mount, leaving its influence contested within and without. International organizations, already weakened, cease to serve as neutral platforms, devolving into theaters of bloc confrontation where accusations of cyber sabotage, espionage, and manipulation dominate every agenda. What was once the global commons of digital space is now an arena of perpetual confrontation. The open-ended conclusion of this phase underlines the structural transformation of global order. The digital Iron Curtain is no longer metaphorical, but the invisible infrastructure of a divided world. It shapes economies, militaries, and societies, embedding itself into the routines of daily life while dictating the trajectories of great power rivalry. Its permanence creates a paradox. Stability now depends on the continuation of fragmentation, but the brittleness of this equilibrium leaves humanity exposed to crises that no bloc can fully control. The unresolved question is whether a fragmented digital order can sustain itself without collapsing into open conflict. Unlike the nuclear standoff of the 20th century, where a single catastrophic weapon served as a deterrent, today's fragmentation operates through countless invisible systems, each capable of escalation, each insulated from dialogue, and each accelerating faster than human reflexes. The defining challenge of the century may not be building more powerful AI, but finding a way to prevent these fractured systems from dragging humanity into a conflict that no one intends, yet no one can stop. The event description begins with a cascade of developments. Washington formalizes its digital alliances by embedding AI interoperability into NATO doctrines and defense pacts, ensuring that member states' systems are unified against external penetration. Beijing institutionalizes its sovereign AI ecosystem as the backbone of its governance model, expanding the digital Silk Road into Latin America and Africa with ironclad contracts that bind infrastructure to Chinese standards. Brussels deepens its regulatory grip by forcing corporations to design AI specifically for the European market, effectively severing global platforms into permanently divergent codes. And Moscow embraces its subordinate role in the Beijing-led system, promoting Chinese AI tools as the foundation of its own digital survival while extending them to regimes facing Western sanctions. In each move, the fragmentation ceases to be a contest and becomes instead the defining feature of the global order. Systemic vulnerabilities crystallize under this permanence. The absence of interoperability is no longer simply inconvenient but existential, as critical infrastructure, financial systems, and defense networks are locked into rival ecosystems with no fail-safe bridge. A cyber attack launched from one bloc cannot be reliably traced, verified, or de-escalated because data systems do not align. Financial markets, once buffered by global redundancy, now fracture along bloc lines, exposing them to sudden collapses triggered by isolated shocks. Populations within each sphere grow accustomed to the epistemological silos produced by their AI systems, internalizing divergent realities that erode the very concept of global public truth. These vulnerabilities compound into a fragile equilibrium. Stability is maintained only by the constant reinforcement of division, leaving the system brittle and prone to cascading crises when shocks inevitably occur. The military escalation advances toward a state of normalized confrontation. Rival blocs integrate AI into command structures, shifting decision-making authority away from human judgment toward algorithmic assessment. The United States deploys AI-assisted missile defense and satellite coordination systems across allied territories, while China operationalizes swarms of AI-guided naval drones in the South China Sea, enforcing territorial claims with automated precision. Russia, leveraging Chinese architectures, integrates AI into hybrid warfare, coordinating disinformation, cyber attacks, and battlefield logistics in Ukraine and beyond. NATO responds by refining predictive algorithms that model adversary intent, but the lack of shared standards means that rival systems increasingly interpret maneuvers through incompatible logics. The risk of automated escalation grows acute. An AI system interpreting a cyber probe as an act of war could trigger retaliation before human leaders are even aware. Military analysts describe this condition as a permanent pressure cooker, where the absence of crisis management protocols between rival AI systems leaves the world perpetually one miscalculation away from catastrophe. Economic ripples under this stage are no longer transient shocks, but systemic distortions. The global economy is now structured around duplicated infrastructures, with multinational corporations forced to maintain separate R&D pipelines, compliance systems, and distribution networks. The cost of this redundancy slows innovation and entrenches inefficiency, leading to persistent inflationary pressures.